I don't know what it was about that Wednesday morning. Maybe the way the sunlight slanted just right through the kitchen blinds, making the coffee steam look like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. I had just gotten back from a meeting with a warehouse client. Nothing big. Just a routine catch-up on inventory software they still didn't understand. I loosened my tie, kicked off my shoes at the door, and went into the kitchen, craving nothing more than a cup of bitter, hot black coffee. Something to push the chill out of my spine. That's when I saw it. The little red dot blinking on my phone like a heartbeat. One voicemail. Just one. I tapped it absently while stirring in half a spoon of sugar. Hazel always said I liked my coffee sad. I almost didn't register her name until the voice kicked in. No greeting. No hesitation. Just Hazel, sharp and cold. You're out of the family business, Luca. Expect a call from our lawyer. Then came Brielle's voice, her sister. Smooth and cruel in that polished PR tone. This is final. The board has moved forward. We wish you the best. That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just that. I stood there for a long second, the coffee mug trembling in my grip. I set it down slowly on the marble counter, afraid that if I blinked too hard, the whole house would shift under my feet. My heart wasn't pounding. It was still, like the breath before a freefall. I replayed the message. I had to be missing something. Maybe it was a prank. A cruel inside joke I wasn't in on. But no, it was real. Hazel's voice, perfectly rehearsed. Brielle, finishing the blow like a second shooter. It felt less like a decision and more like an execution. They'd practiced this. Sat somewhere with a notepad and rehearsed what to say and how to say it. They didn't even have the guts to call live. Just a message. Left at 10:42 a.m., time-stamped like a bullet casing. I didn't scream. That's what surprised me. I didn't smash the mug or call her back and demand an explanation. I just stood there, staring at the black coffee cooling beside me, until it matched the temperature of my chest. Hazel and I had been married for 8 years. Built a life, or so I thought. We had a routine, dinners every Friday, Sunday hikes in the fall, inside jokes about bad reality TV. We shared more than a home. We shared a company, a vision. Or at least I thought we did. Her family owned Mirabelle and Company, yes. But I had built my stake. I wasn't a hanger-on. I wasn't some pity hire married into the boardroom. I had sacrificed. And not just hours. I gave up weekends, holidays, entire chunks of myself, trying to keep that place running. And now, I was dismissed like an unpaid intern who overstayed his welcome. I stared out the kitchen window, watching leaves rustle in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed and a dog barked. The world didn't pause for heartbreak. It never did. My phone buzzed again. A follow-up text from Hazel? No. An ad for lawn fertilizer. Of course. I picked up my phone again. My fingers hovered over her contact. Hazel, my love. That's what it still said. I hadn't changed it since the honeymoon. My thumb hovered over the call icon. Then I switched to messages. My hands were steady, surprisingly so. I typed one word. Understood. That was all. No begging. No questions. No rage. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the bomb she dropped. I hit send. The message bubble turned blue. Read. Nothing more came. I stood there, still in my dress shirt, coffee forgotten, the voicemail still echoing like a slow poison. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like every molecule had turned against me. I sank into one of the kitchen stools and let the silence wrap itself around me. This house, this life, we built it together. Or so I thought. I remembered the night we signed our first deal. Hazel had popped a bottle of Prosecco on the porch, barefoot, dancing to music on her phone. She'd called me her quiet genius. Back then, it felt like love. Now, I wondered if it had always been performance. I thought of her father, the way he shook my hand when he retired. He said I reminded him of himself when he still gave a damn. He gave me 45% of the company not as a gift, but because I earned it. Worked for it. Now I was being cut loose without so much as a conversation. I reached into the cabinet for a glass, not coffee this time. Scotch. Neat. It was too early, and I didn't care. I took a sip and let the burn remind me I was still standing. My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't look. That silence, mine, not theirs, would be the loudest thing I ever said. And they would hear it. Every single day. I met Hazel in a shared economics class during junior year. She was bold and sharp, always 2 steps ahead of the discussion. I sat in the third row with my notes in crisp order, content to let others talk. She noticed me because I didn't try to impress her. That's what she once told me on our second date. Everyone else performs. You just show up. Back then, it sounded like admiration. Now, I wonder if it was foreshadowing. After we graduated, Hazel took the spotlight with her sister Brielle, joining their father at Mirabelle and Company, a boutique logistics firm built by their grandfather and expanded by their dad. I didn't walk into the company through Hazel. I entered through the back door, operations intern, unpaid for the first 6 months. Hazel didn't even mention we were dating until the end of that year. I worked every angle: supply chains, vendor logistics, fleet efficiency. I was the guy people called when deliveries went wrong, when trucks broke down at 2 a.m., when warehouse managers missed quotas. I solved fires before they sparked. That was my skill, making the hard parts invisible. Hazel and Brielle were always at the front: brand launches, trade shows, news interviews. The face and the voice. Meanwhile, I was the hands, the unglamorous middle. When their father retired, he handed me something I never asked for: 45% of the company's shares. Everyone clapped. Everyone smiled. Hazel included. But the silence between us that night was heavy. "You know what this means," she said, sitting cross-legged on our bed. "You're not just the guy behind the curtain anymore." She meant it as a compliment. I heard it as a warning. The years that followed blurred into long nights and endless forecasts. I wasn't bitter. I believed in the mission. I believed in them. There were moments when it felt like a partnership. When Hazel would text me at 1 a.m., "We couldn't do this without you," and I'd smile in the dark. I held on to those little signs. Because I thought I mattered. Not just as her husband, but as her equal. But slowly, the seams began to pull. I started noticing changes in the board meetings, items skipped over, votes taken while I was working late in the dispatch unit. Financial projections didn't match internal trends. Budget decisions were approved without my review. I chalked it up to oversight. I didn't want to believe Hazel, my Hazel, was part of it. She'd brush me off with a kiss. "Let us handle this part, babe. You've done enough. You need to breathe too." But her version of breathing meant keeping me far from strategy. I was a fixer, not a visionary. I wasn't the polished speaker or the charming negotiator. I was the guy with spreadsheets and quiet solutions. That suited everyone just fine, until the moment they decided I no longer suited the company. The voicemail didn't hurt because it was abrupt. It hurt because it confirmed what I had been avoiding for months. I was no longer wanted. Not just as an executive, but as a partner. The marriage and the business were tangled together like wires behind a wall. And Hazel, with one message, cut through both. The part that stung the most wasn't that they fired me. It was that they didn't even pretend to value the years I gave them. They didn't soften the blow with a face-to-face conversation or a call filled with half-hearted regrets. They used a voicemail, like they were canceling a dentist appointment. I found myself standing in the company's empty executive lounge 2 days after the message. Nobody had officially removed me from the building yet. It was early, before 7 a.m., and the place smelled like polished oak and overbrewed coffee. I looked at the framed company photo from 3 years ago. Hazel stood in the center, Brielle on her right, and me, off to the side, barely visible behind one of the junior partners. Smiling, yes, but fading. I remembered what Hazel's father said during that photo shoot. "You don't always have to be in the spotlight to hold the frame together." He meant it as wisdom, but maybe it was just a polite warning. I should have paid attention. I returned home and sat in the living room, watching the ceiling fan spin. I thought about every moment I swallowed doubt. Every time I told myself, "It's not that serious. They'll come around." But they never did, because they never had to. I made it easy. I showed up, cleaned messes, fixed their mistakes, and never once asked for credit. I made myself essential, but not indispensable. And when people can't imagine losing you, they'll protect you. But when they know you'll stay no matter how you're treated, they stop trying. Hazel didn't even try. I opened my laptop that night and started digging through payroll ledgers, project timelines, my original shareholder agreement. I wasn't looking to retaliate. Not yet. I just needed to remind myself of the truth. I was part of this company. I gave it life when shipments stalled, when contracts broke, when morale dipped. I kept it breathing. Now they were acting like I never mattered. That I had been carried instead of carrying. But I wasn't going to scream or demand respect. No. I was going to find the margin where they tried to write me off, and I was going to rewrite it. Quietly. With precision. They thought I was just a numbers guy. They were about to learn what numbers can do when they're weaponized by the man who built them. I was eating lunch alone when I saw it. The restaurant was quiet, midweek lull, half full. I sat by the window, half focused on a grilled chicken sandwich I wasn't enjoying and scanning logistics reports on my tablet. The sunlight hit the glass just right, making the screen glare. So I set it aside, picked up my phone, and absent-mindedly opened Instagram. And there it was, right between a travel blogger's waterfall shot and an ad for custom watches. Hazel, smiling like betrayal tasted sweet. Brielle beside her, one hand raised mid-toast. And between them stood a man I had never seen before. Tall, confident, wearing a deep navy suit that probably cost more than my mortgage. The caption read, "A new chapter for Mirabelle and Company begins, with innovation and vision." I didn't blink. My thumb froze above the screen. The sandwich grew cold in my hand. Innovation and vision. I read those words over and over. They might as well have posted a video of them driving a knife between my ribs. So this was it. The replacement. The new partner. Not a single board memo. Not a single courtesy call. They moved on with the kind of speed you only achieve when you've been planning it for months. And I had been too blind, too trusting, to see the writing on the wall. My appetite disappeared. I closed the app and just sat there, the chatter of nearby tables fading into a muffled buzz. I was numb, but not surprised. That's what hurt the most. I'd seen the signs, but I'd filed them under temporary tension. I thought they'd pass, that we'd circle back. I didn't expect this permanent exclusion. I paid the bill in silence and left the restaurant. Back at home, the walls of the house I once called ours felt too wide. Hazel's touches were still everywhere. Throw pillows she obsessed over, succulents that somehow thrived despite my neglect, the scent of her lavender oil lingering near the stairs. I stood in the living room, phone in hand, and stared at her contact. I should have deleted it. I should have walked away. But something inside me, maybe the part that still needed to believe she could explain this, told me to call. She picked up on the third ring. "Well, look who remembered I exist," Hazel answered, her voice light but tight, like she was trying to sound unbothered. I could hear a faint hum of conversation behind her, glasses clinking, people talking. A celebration. Probably the same one from the photo. "What the hell is going on, Hazel?" I said, calm but cutting. She laughed softly. "Luca, don't be dramatic. Everything's just moving quickly right now." "Quickly? You brought in a partner without informing me. I still own 45%. Technically," she said, stretching the word like taffy. "But you've been disengaged. We needed someone with actual strategic direction." That word again. Strategy. Like I was some glorified clipboard holder. And then Brielle's voice chimed in, louder, closer to the phone. "You were always better at spreadsheets than steering the ship anyway, Luca. No hard feelings." I felt something break. It didn't crack loudly. It didn't shatter all at once. It just broke, quietly, like a tired thread giving way after holding too much for too long. I hung up without another word. No yelling. No arguing. They weren't worth the performance. Instead, I went to my office and pulled out a binder labeled Legacy Docs. In it were all my ownership documents. My copies of quarterly contributions. Records of every time I used personal funds to cover payroll shortfalls or front delivery equipment repairs without charging interest. Every line signed by Hazel or Brielle. Proof, not just of my role, but of their dependency on me. For years, I told myself I was building with them, that we were a team. But teams don't cut you out behind your back. Teams don't toast to your replacement on Instagram while you're still paying property taxes on the company HQ. I poured a drink, sat down at the desk, and I stared at my name on those contracts like I was looking at a stranger. I didn't know how long I sat there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 2 hours, but by the time I stood up, something had shifted in me. Not rage, not despair, something sharper, more focused. They thought I was the silent one, the safe one, the man who kept the gears turning but never touched the steering wheel. They built a brand on my back and decided it was okay to discard me like a placeholder in their narrative. But they forgot the most important rule in business. You never underestimate the man who keeps the books. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. Reclamation. Inside, I dropped scans of every signed contract, annotated emails, calendar invites showing my involvement in major deals, personal financial transfers, everything. I labeled each one meticulously. No flair, no emotion, just facts. The kind of facts that don't ask for attention, but command consequences. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet. But for the first time since that voicemail, I felt like I could breathe again. Not because I had clarity, but because I had nothing left to lose. And men with nothing left to lose? They don't yell. They don't beg. They build. Quietly. Thoroughly. And when they're done building, they make sure the people who once toasted without them never drink easy again. Here's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you realize you've been invisible in your own life. I sat at the edge of her bed that evening, the light from the hallway catching on the framed wedding photo still hanging on the wall. Hazel was in white, delicate lace along her collarbone, laughing as I kissed her knuckles. I remembered that moment. It felt real then. She had squeezed my hand before the photographer clicked, a little signal that we were in this together. I used to look at that photo when days were hard, when the work felt like drowning. Now it just felt like a staged lie. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. The late-night meetings I was never looped into. It's just branding stuff, she'd say, pecking me on the cheek like a pat on the head. The board votes scheduled without me. Oh, we assumed you were too buried in logistics, Brielle would explain, sipping her matcha like it was a cure for guilt. I had trained myself to accept it, to interpret exclusion as trust. You're the backbone, Hazel would say, and we don't want to burn you out. I thought she meant that lovingly. Now I know it meant, stay in your lane. But I didn't just stay. I gave. I poured myself into every corner of that company. The late fees I quietly paid off from our joint account when the fulfillment warehouse flooded. The bonuses I suggested we delay when we had a down quarter, except I still made sure payroll hit on time. The branding deal that nearly collapsed when a distributor pulled out? I called in a favor from a supplier I met 5 years ago, salvaged the entire shipment route, and never once asked for public credit. I was the behind-the-scenes husband, the man who held the camera instead of posing for it. Hazel and Brielle liked to call me their safety net, the one who caught problems before they reached them. They said it like a compliment. But what's a net, really? Something stretched thin, something used and walked across. And when it rips, they replace it. I walked through our house that night and saw the story I'd ignored. Everything in here bore Hazel's taste: sage green walls, framed quotes about ambition and power, minimalist furniture that somehow never felt comfortable. I'd learned to fit into her aesthetic, just like I'd learned to shrink into my role at the company. It wasn't resentment I felt. It was embarrassment. Embarrassment that I'd mistaken proximity for partnership. Because I truly believed we were a team. That every sacrifice I made, working 70-hour weeks, skipping holidays, not pushing back when Brielle steamrolled over my projections, was for our future. Our shared empire. But it wasn't. I was building their dream, funded with my sweat, my savings, and my silence. I remember one winter when we almost missed payroll. Hazel panicked. She looked at me like the floor had vanished under her heels. I said nothing. Just opened my private account and wired enough to cover every staff member, down to the weekend janitors. I didn't want applause. I just didn't want our people to suffer. She kissed me hard that night and called me her hero. Now she's toasting new partners in dresses I haven't seen her wear in years. I walked into my office and pulled open the drawer with the manila folders. One of them was labeled contingencies. Inside were invoices I'd fronted for outsourced fleet management, hazmat compliance training I paid for out of pocket, and debt restructuring paperwork from a year ago that I'd handled while Hazel was in Turks and Caicos with Brielle for a wellness retreat. None of this had been glamorous. None of it had ever been mentioned on social media or in shareholder letters. But every time the company made it through a rough quarter, it was because I had been plugging the holes underwater while they stood on deck waving to investors. It was strange. I didn't feel rage. I felt power. Quiet, steady power. Because I knew something they didn't. They thought I was just the husband, the fixer, the man who didn't speak unless asked a question. But I had everything documented. Everything. They had faces and flair. I had the foundation. And the thing about foundations? You never notice them until they crack. I sat at my desk and opened an email draft addressed to no one. A way to think out loud. I am not disposable, I typed. I am not an accessory to your image. I am the reason your image was ever stable. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in months, I saw myself clearly. Not as the husband in the background. Not as the co-founder left off the press releases. But as the one man holding all the receipts. And if they wanted to pretend I didn't matter, fine. I could vanish. But I'd make sure when I did, the silence I left behind would be the loudest sound they'd ever hear. I didn't go to war. I went to Miriam. It was a quiet Thursday when I pulled into the underground parking garage of Whitestone Legal. My hands weren't shaking, though I expected them to be. Everything that had happened should have made me furious, should have had me pacing, shouting, unraveling. But instead, there was this eerie calm. Like something inside me had gone still to make room for precision. Miriam Graves had been a rising legal star when we met 5 years ago. She was launching a niche startup to help small logistics firms handle cross-state compliance. She needed expertise in operational modeling. I gave her my nights for 3 weeks straight. No fee, just goodwill. She called me a logistics surgeon in an email once. I never deleted it. Now, I needed her scalpel. Her office looked like something from a legal drama: tall glass windows, steel gray bookshelves, a wall of framed accolades that were somehow tasteful and intimidating at once. Miriam stood when I entered. Sharp suit. No nonsense. But the second she saw my face, her expression softened. "Luca," she said, gesturing toward the seat across from her. "I was wondering when you'd call." That sentence landed like a weight. She already knew something was wrong. Of course she did. I didn't waste time. I opened the leather folder I had carried in and spread out the contents like evidence on a courtroom table. Contracts, transaction logs, signed approvals, emails, the paper trail of my sacrifice. She flipped through the documents in silence, eyes scanning, highlighter dancing. When she got to the shareholder agreement, the one Hazel's father signed before retiring, she paused. Her lips tightened. 45%, she murmured. And no retraction clause without mutual consent. "You're still very much in this company." I nodded. They left a voicemail. Her brow lifted slightly. "They what?" I tapped my phone, hit play. Hazel and Brielle's voices spilled out into the office like ghosts from another life. Miriam listened with her arms crossed, expression unreadable. When it ended, she leaned back, exhaled slowly, and stared at me. "They're either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident you won't push back." "I've never been the loud one," I said. She tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time you make some noise." I stared at her, weighing that. Making noise had never been my style. I built quietly. I solved problems without drawing attention. But this wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about revenge either. It was about making sure they never erased me again. "I don't want to go back," I said finally. "Not to the company. Not to her." Miriam nodded. "Then let's talk about leaving. On your terms." She explained it with clinical precision. I didn't need to fight them in court. I could sell. Not to them, but to someone who would force their hand. A private venture fund, she said, could buy out my shares and enforce corporate accountability. No yelling. No lawsuits. Just a clean, strategic extraction with devastating consequences for anyone who wasn't playing by the rules. She already had someone in mind. "They specialize in ownership transitions," she said. "Think of them as corporate vacuum cleaners. Ruthless, tidy, and thorough." That was exactly what I wanted. I gave her permission to initiate contact, and before I left, she said something that stuck with me. "Luca, they thought they were cutting you off. What they actually did was light the match under their own foundation. Most men in your position would be out for blood. But you? You're out for closure. That's dangerous. In the best way." I left her office without a backward glance. The next few days moved quickly. The fund, named Sable Grove Partners, was sharper than I expected. They asked for everything: documented roles, financial history, digital access to the company's books. I gave them all of it. Quietly. No announcements. No warnings. Just a surgical upload of truth. What struck me most was how simple it was. No fireworks. No screaming matches or angry boardroom showdowns. Just lawyers and numbers. And with every file I handed over, I felt something loosen inside my chest. It wasn't just business anymore. It was cleansing. Hazel still hadn't called. Neither had Brielle. Maybe they thought my silence meant surrender. Let them think that. When the preliminary valuation came back, Sable Grove offered full market value for my shares. No haggling. No delay. They wanted my stake clean and fast. I sat in Miriam's office the morning I signed the final documents. She watched me carefully. "You sure you're ready to be done?" she asked. I looked down at the contract. I think I was done the moment I hit play on that voicemail. The pen felt heavy in my hand. Not because I doubted the decision, but because it was final. This wasn't just walking away. This was ending the chapter before they could rewrite it without me. I signed, page after page, name after name. When it was over, I stood. Miriam extended her hand. "They won't see this coming." "Good," I said, because I didn't either. That night, I went home and poured myself a drink, not out of grief, but ritual. I sat on the back deck. The city lights faint in the distance and finally replied to Hazel's voicemail. One word. Understood. No venom. No fear. Just a seal on the silence. And somewhere deep in the dark, I knew what was coming next. The silence was about to get very, very loud. I didn't tell anyone when I signed the papers. No announcements. No press release. Just me, Miriam, a stack of contracts, and a pen that glided smoother than I expected. Selling my 45% stake in Mirabel and Company should have felt like cutting off a limb. Instead, it felt like closing a door I hadn't realized was open for too long. The buyers, Sable Grove Partners, moved quickly. They didn't waste time with pleasantries or inflated egos. They saw what I saw. A valuable company being mismanaged by people more interested in image than infrastructure. Once the ink dried, the silence settled in. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was weighted. Like a storm cloud too still to trust. I went home, changed into a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, and walked into the kitchen where Hazel's ceramic mugs still hung from the rack she insisted on installing. I made myself tea instead of coffee, calm instead of caffeine. My phone was on silent, screen down on the counter. I didn't want any distractions when I sent the message. I pulled up the voicemail again, Hazel and Brielle's voices, stiff with rehearsed authority, and played it once more. You're out of the family business, Luca. Expect a call from our lawyer. Brielle's voice followed, polished and smug. This is final. I stopped the playback, closed my eyes, and exhaled. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Understood. The message felt like closure. I hit send. I didn't expect a response. Not right away. Maybe not at all. They had gotten what they wanted, hadn't they? Or so they thought. They'd cut me out, pushed me aside like a file they no longer needed on the server. The last thing they'd expect was to wake up and find the locks changed. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I didn't dream about the office, about Hazel's cold stares or Brielle's dismissive smirks. I didn't replay meetings where I'd been muted or overruled. My body finally understood it wasn't being held hostage anymore. By morning, the silence cracked. The first sign came not from Hazel, but from a mutual contact, Jordan, the CFO I'd brought on 2 years ago. He was the first to text, "Hey man, did you approve the Sable Grove acquisition? I thought you were still on hold with the audit committee." I stared at the message for a moment, then smiled faintly. The ripple had begun. Sable Grove had done their homework. They weren't buying goodwill, they were buying leverage. They didn't just acquire my shares, they acquired the ability to see the whole boardroom from a different angle. They requested internal audits, reevaluated quarterly projections, froze discretionary spending, and paused all new vendor contracts. And they did it all within 48 hours. That's when Hazel called. I didn't answer. Then Brielle texted, "Did you seriously just sell to Sable Grove? Luca, they're tearing apart the budget." I left it on read. By the third day, my missed call log looked like a stock ticker. Hazel, Brielle, their attorney, the HR director, even Hazel's mother. It was all happening faster than they could process. Because they hadn't planned for me to leave strategically. They expected me to crawl away wounded, not walk away holding the detonator. I finally answered on call 93. Hazel's voice was frantic, stripped of her usual composure. "Luca, you can't do this. You didn't even give us a chance to eat." "To what?" I asked calmly. "Explain after the fact? You sold your shares to vultures," she hissed. "They're threatening to restructure the entire company. They're looking at everything, old budgets, travel expenses, vendor payments." "Good," I said. "Maybe they'll find what I found." There was a pause. Then Brielle's voice cut in. "We didn't mean to push you out like that, Luca. We were just trying to move fast." "No, you meant it. You wanted me quiet. Gone. Erased. You wanted my silence without earning it. Now you're going to learn what silence costs." Hazel exhaled like she'd been punched. "You never wanted revenge. That's not who you are." She was right. I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. And when that wasn't an option, I chose consequence. "I'm not coming back," I said, final and clear. "I'm not interested in undoing what's done. You made your move. I made mine." I hung up before they could respond. Not out of anger, but to preserve what little grace I had left. The next few days were a blur of second-hand updates. Sable Grove appointed their own CFO to conduct an internal review. They asked tough questions, ones that Hazel and Brielle weren't prepared to answer. Travel reimbursements flagged. Inflated contractor fees questioned. Bonuses issued during negative quarters red flagged. And then came the internal memo. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did. A former assistant forwarded it to me. The subject line read, Mirabelle and Company, Phase 1 Restructuring. The content was short, clinical, cold. Effective immediately, Sable Grove will initiate performance-based staff assessments. All C-suite decisions will be temporarily frozen. An operational efficiency audit will commence Monday. Translation? They were cleaning house. And I wasn't there to stop it. Not because I couldn't, but because I chose not to. The house they tried to kick me out of? I sold it, with termites still in the walls. And now the new owners were bringing bulldozers. The first call came at 6:14 a.m. I was brushing my teeth when the screen lit up. Hazel. I didn't answer. I just let the buzzing stop while I leaned over the sink, spit, rinsed, and stared at myself in the mirror. There were new lines under my eyes. I looked older than I felt, but calmer, too. Solid. I watched the phone go dark again on the counter. Then it rang again. Hazel. Then Brielle. Then the office line from Mirabelle and Company. By the time I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the screen had 20 missed calls. I scrolled through them absently, like flipping through pages in a magazine I didn't care to finish. I set the phone to silent and poured maple syrup on my toast. Ate slowly. Enjoyed it. The next time I checked, the number was up to 42. By mid-afternoon, 92. Calls, voicemails, texts. Some panicked. Some pleading. Most angry. The kind of frantic chaos that only happens when people realize too late that the floor beneath them was never theirs to stand on. I finally picked up the 93rd. Luca. Hazel's voice cracked across the line like someone was shaking her. Luca, you have to talk to me. I said nothing. They're freezing our accounts, she rushed on. Our marketing funds, our discretionary budgets, everything's locked. They're asking for invoices I've never even seen. Brielle's voice jumped in from the background. They're talking about breach claims. Do you understand what you've done? I sipped my coffee. You made it clear. I wasn't part of the business anymore. I figured I should act like it. That's not what we meant, Hazel snapped. I smiled to myself. You said it in a voicemail. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear Hazel breathing, shallow and uneven. You sold to people who are digging into every detail of our operations, she said, voice lower now. They've already suspended 3 department heads. They're threatening to reverse our Q2 bonuses. They're looking at things we did for morale. For the brand. For yourselves, I said calmly. Not for the company. Brielle's voice sharpened. You've always been petty. You think you're so noble, but you waited until we made a move to strike back. No, I replied. I waited until I realized you'd never see me as more than a spare tire. You only needed me when something went flat. Hazel tried again, gentler this time. We were under pressure, Luca. Things moved quickly. Maybe we made a mistake. But this is cruel. No, I said again. This is math. Actions have costs. You dismissed me without a conversation. You replaced me in a press post. You never even asked what I wanted. She was quiet. I didn't want revenge, I continued. I wanted to be respected. You didn't give me that. So I gave myself the closure you never offered. There was nothing else to say. I hung up. This time, I didn't feel angry or sad. I didn't feel triumphant either. It wasn't victory. It was confirmation. That my silence had weight. That my absence had teeth. I took a walk to clear my head, phone left behind. The late afternoon breeze cut through my shirt and pulled at the edges of my thoughts. I walked past the shops Hazel used to drag me into, eco-home boutiques with overpriced faces, skincare spots with walls of rosewater and glass. I remembered how she used to talk to the owners like she was mentoring them. I'd just stand behind her, holding the bags. The invisible husband. Back then, I thought that was love. Now I knew it was positioning. When I got home, there were 11 new voicemails. I didn't listen to any of them. I forwarded them to Miriam instead. Sable Grove had already begun their full operational audit. Miriam had warned me. Once the documents were reviewed, the fallout would be brutal. She wasn't exaggerating. Hazel and Brielle had run parts of the business like a trust fund hobby. Their branding trips to Napa, Paris, Santorini, Mazda's global strategy tours were all being reviewed. Expense reports were riddled with personal costs. Some staff had received double bonuses. There were vendor contracts approved without cross-signatures, some of which linked back to friends of Brielle, who'd been quietly overcharging the company. I'd seen the signs. I just hadn't known how deep it went. And now? They were panicking because the man they pushed out had been the only one holding it all together. Later that evening, I poured a glass of bourbon and stepped out onto the balcony. The sky was darkening, streaked with orange and violet. My phone buzzed once more. This time, I answered. Hazel's voice was different, smaller. They're going to dissolve the board, she said. Sable Grove's cleaning house. Good, I replied. They want me to take a leave of absence. You should, I said. You need time to remember what actual work feels like. Another silence. I didn't want it to end like this, she whispered. Neither did I. I hung up again. The last words I spoke that day were to myself. You wanted to erase me. Now you're learning what it feels like to be erased. And the truth is, the numbers never lie. But people? They lie to your face. Then they cry when the truth shows up in a tailored suit holding a balance sheet. The audit reports came in like a slow flood, one file at a time, each more damning than the last. Miriam sent me the first summary in a password-protected email titled, Findings, Phase 1. I sat in my home office, the only light coming from my monitor, and read through line after line with the kind of quiet that only precedes demolition. Sable Grove's forensic team had been thorough. They weren't just looking for errors, they were digging for deception. And they found it in every corner of the business I'd once helped hold upright. The first red flag was the travel budget. Over 18 months, nearly $430,000 had been funneled into global expansion initiatives, most of which were luxury retreats, influencer summits, and private excursions to wine regions that had nothing to do with logistics or operations. Photos posted to Instagram had long been scrubbed or archived, but expense reports told the truth. Brielle was the biggest offender. She'd been submitting overlapping invoices, booking through her personal assistant and again through the company card. Duplicate entries. Slightly altered descriptions. A hotel listed as client meeting venue in one file and leadership wellness stay in another. One resort in Tulum even had a spa receipt billed under market research, Latin America expansion. I remembered that trip. She came back tanned, laughing, talking about the emotional energy of quartz. I hadn't questioned it. I should have. Hazel's name came up next. Not in grand fraud, but in silent approval. She'd co-signed half the reimbursements. Backdated others. Forwarded payment emails with the phrase, clear this for optics, but flag as internal. What that meant in practice was, don't ask questions, just make it disappear. The buyers found it all. The breaches weren't just technical, they were strategic. They had created a shell of a company with designer veneers and hollow books. And my quiet, invisible contributions? The money I wired during bad quarters? It had covered the shortfall, paid off vendors, padded payroll when marketing drained the reserves. My sacrifices had funded their facade, and now the buyers had receipts. Miriam called me 2 days after the full audit dropped. They're preparing breach of fiduciary duty claims, she said. They won't press charges unless Hazel and Brielle contest the restructuring, but they've made it clear. If either of them obstructs the transition, they'll go public. I leaned back in my chair, the ceiling fan whirring above me. So they're backed into a corner. Exactly, Miriam said. Hazel is still trying to negotiate a softer exit. But Brielle? She's panicking. She called the auditors yesterday and accused them of harassment. I couldn't help but laugh. She thought branding could save everything. I said, you can't hashtag your way out of an audit. They've also asked me to relay something, Miriam added. The board wants to meet with you. Not for decisions. For clarification. Historical record. Your name is on too many foundational documents for them to close this chapter without your version. I stared at the phone. They want to understand how it got this bad, she said. They already know, I replied. They just didn't want to believe it. That night, I opened the shared drive that housed every internal project from the last 6 years. I didn't need access anymore. Sable Grove had full control. But I looked anyway. Some part of me needed to see it again. To look at what I helped build before it was buried under spin and smiling faces. I found an old proposal Hazel and I wrote together. An internal development roadmap from 4 years ago. The title page had both our names. The tone was optimistic. Clear goals. Honest projections. That version of us had been real, once. Before ego. Before image. Before Brielle convinced Hazel that emotion had no place in leadership and that I, with all my practicality and quiet, wasn't a partner, just a placeholder. They'd made their choices. And now, it was their turn to be scrutinized. Hazel texted me again the next morning. Can we talk? I'm not defending everything, but there's context you don't know. I didn't respond. A few hours later, Another message came through. This one from Brielle. You've made your point. You've embarrassed us enough. Just remember, if you had spoken up, none of this would have happened. You stayed silent until it benefited you. I stared at her words for a long time. Silence. That was the weapon they gave me. That's what they mistook for weakness. They never noticed that I'd been documenting everything. Not out of malice. Out of habit. I believed in records. Accuracy. Accountability. They gambled on the assumption that I wouldn't fight back. What they didn't count on was that I wouldn't need to. I didn't have to sabotage them. They were already standing on a house of glass. Overdrawn accounts, false confidence, and the illusion of control. All I did was pull my weight out from under the structure. And it collapsed. I didn't hate them. That was the strangest part. I didn't wish them suffering. I just wanted them to see me. To realize that while they curated the image, I carried the burden. Hazel once told me, after one of our best quarters, "You're the safest man I know." I remember smiling then, thinking it was a compliment. Now I know what she meant. Safe meant invisible, predictable, easy to overlook. They built their empire on my shoulders and called me dependable. But the moment I stepped away, they found out what I'd really been. Essential. The final notice came on a rainy Tuesday, delivered by a courier with tired eyes and a rain-speckled envelope. I already knew what was inside before I opened it. The return address read her name in bold print, Hazel Mirabelle Cross. No company logo, no apology, just the raw formality of someone who'd once shared my pillow, now submitting documents to end a shared life. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I sat at the dining table where we used to host quiet dinners, her candlelit centerpieces still shoved in a drawer somewhere, and unfolded the papers. Petition for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences, accompanied by a supplemental claim for emotional distress and reputational damage due to unexpected and aggressive divestment actions by respondent. She had made it sound so clinical, like we weren't lovers once, like I hadn't spent years defending her decisions, biting my tongue at Brielle's entitlement, covering company debts, and believing in her brilliance even when it came at the cost of my own. She didn't mention that, just that I'd made her look weak. I slid the papers aside and sat back in my chair. The thunder rumbled outside, low and distant, like a war too far gone to stop. This wasn't a rupture. It was a burial. We weren't just ending a business or a marriage. We were laying to rest the illusion that either had ever been mutual. Mirabelle and Company had been officially dissolved a week earlier. Sable Grove dismantled it piece by piece. The logistics core, the contracts I'd cultivated, the vendor relationships I'd maintained. Those were salvaged and absorbed into a leaner division under new leadership. The name Mirabelle was removed from every document, every title, every digital footer. The brand was gone. The logo scrubbed. The social media accounts deleted or archived. Brielle had been fired. Hazel was placed on unpaid leave pending the results of Sable Grove's breach of duty review, which, Miriam informed me, was already leaning toward public censure unless she agreed to withdraw completely and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The legacy they'd been so desperate to control, it had been dismantled in weeks. And all I did was sell. Not because I wanted to burn it all down, because I was tired of pretending I mattered to people who only needed me when the roof leaked. Grief came in strange waves. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet. A fork in the sink that used to be hers. An empty toothbrush holder. A recipe note left in the margins of our shared cookbook. Add cinnamon for warmth. H. I stared at that scribble longer than I should have. There had been warmth once. And laughter. And belief. But it had all been buried beneath ambition and control. We didn't lose each other overnight. We drifted slowly, steadily, pretending the distance was just temporary. I told myself her coldness was stress, that her silence was focus. But deep down, I knew. I had known for months. Maybe years. She saw me as reliable, not exciting. Solid, not brilliant. Steady, not necessary. And once I stopped serving her narrative, I was expendable. I didn't contest the divorce. Miriam offered options. We could challenge the distress claim. We have leverage. I declined. What was the point? Let her write the ending she wanted. I had already started a news story. The last time I saw Hazel was in a conference room, 2 weeks before the papers arrived. She wore a pale blue blazer and no makeup. Her hands trembled when she reached for the coffee the assistant offered. I almost didn't recognize her without the armor of confidence. She looked at me like she didn't know where to start. Do you hate me? She asked, finally. I didn't answer right away. I watched her, the woman I once built a life around, now sitting across from me like a stranger wearing a costume made from memories. No, I said. I just don't respect you anymore. Her eyes welled, but she blinked it back. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. You explained with a voicemail, I replied. You made your decision. All I did was believe you. She nodded, looking down. We were supposed to build something lasting. We did, I said. You just didn't like that I held the foundation. That was the last real conversation we had. She sent a follow-up email a week later. I hope someday we can talk without lawyers in the room. I didn't reply. The strangest part of grief is not the moments when you feel broken. It's the moments when you feel nothing at all, when you look at the ruins and feel no urge to rebuild. Just a quiet acknowledgement that you've survived the collapse. That was me now. The house was quiet. My life was simple. No more board meetings. No more explaining my worth. No more dinners where my ideas were nodded at and then ignored. Hazel had her silence. So did I. Only mine had peace in it. I looked at the signed divorce papers one last time before sliding them into a file drawer labeled Closed Chapters. A formality. A signature. A funeral with no flowers. No music. Just truth. And truth, when you finally stop fighting it, doesn't need ceremony. It just needs to be accepted. Now I live in the quiet. The kind that doesn't feel empty, just honest. My house sits on the outskirts of Charlotte, nestled between pine and maple, tucked far enough from the main road that visitors hesitate at the gate. That's how I like it. The villa is modest by the standards Hazel used to chase. One floor, broad windows, no marble, just warm wood, clean lines, and space that breathes. I wake up with the sun, no alarms, no bored calls, no tension coiled in my spine before my feet touch the floor. I didn't just leave the company. I left the version of myself who begged to be seen. The mornings are slower now. Coffee brewed on my schedule. My inbox is lean. Founders, startups, logistics heads wanting strategy without spin. That's what I offer now, clarity. I don't pitch dreams. I patch holes. Quietly. Thoroughly. I've become the guy you call when you're 2 bad quarters from collapse and need someone to cut through the noise. I'm not flashy. I don't sell visions. I offer survival. And they listen. Because unlike Hazel and Brielle, these people know what it costs to build something that doesn't crumble under the weight of ego. I named the firm Crosspoint, not because I needed my name on a door, but because I wanted it to stand for something grounded. A pivot. A clean line from disaster to decision. It's just me and 2 analysts I trust. No one here cares what shoes you wear to work or how viral your brand is. We deal in substance. Sometimes I wonder if Hazel follows the new name. If she's watched me rebuild from the sidelines. If she regrets the way things ended. I know she sent a few emails. Apologies dressed in justifications. Brielle tried too. One long message about perspective and legacy and how we all got caught up in the image. I didn't reply to either of them. Not because I'm cruel, but because they were right, in a way. I was the numbers guy, the quiet husband, the dependable one. But they forgot something critical. I wasn't just keeping the lights on. I was wiring the whole system. And I didn't need their apology to validate that anymore. One evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the breeze move through the trees. My neighbor's kids were playing with a dog in their yard, laughing, tumbling over each other in the grass. The kind of laughter that doesn't carry history behind it. It reminded me that life doesn't stop when people fail you. It just shifts, finds new ways to offer beauty, if you're willing to see it. I get calls now from people who used to ignore me in board meetings. CFOs who used to nod and dismiss. Now they ask for my input, my feedback, my time. They say things like, I wish we'd appreciated you more back then. I keep those calls short, respectful, professional, but I don't pretend to forget, because I'm not angry anymore. But I remember everything. One client, a startup logistics firm based out of Raleigh, asked me once why I left a company as legendary as Mirabelle and Company. I smiled and gave them the diplomatic answer. The story got too loud. I said, I needed room to hear myself think again. It was true in a way, but the full truth was more personal. They built their empire on aesthetics, on applause. I built it on sacrifice. And when the applause stopped, only one of us had anything left to stand on. They overlooked me for years. In meetings, in speeches, in press releases. I was always Hazel's husband, the operations guy, Mr. Quiet Genius. It was meant to flatter, but it flattened me instead. Now, I'm not the man in the background. I'm the man who walked away when the stage got too crowded and built something better off-screen. Sometimes, late at night, I think about who I used to be. The man who waited up for Hazel's plane to land, who canceled trips to make sure her presentations launched on time, who edited budgets while she slept, just to make her feel like the business was thriving. He loved her deeply. He believed in the future they planned. But he's gone now, and I don't miss him. I kept one photo from that life, just one. It's not from the wedding or a party. It's from a night in our first office when the power went out and Hazel and I worked by candlelight, laughing as we hand-wrote shipping labels to keep an order on schedule. Before the brand deals, before the boardrooms, before the betrayals. That was us at our purest, unvarnished, unentitled, unstoppable. I keep that photo in a drawer, not on display. Not because I'm hiding it, but because I've learned to carry the past without letting it decorate the present. This life is quiet. It doesn't trend. It doesn't sparkle. But it's mine. And the best part? I no longer fight to be noticed. Because I finally see myself. And that's enough. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Not mine exactly, but my son Mason's wedding. I had spent years imagining this day, standing proudly at the back of the hall, watching him start a new life with someone he loved. I'd pictured it 100 different ways. Maybe I'd cry a little, maybe I'd laugh a lot. Maybe I'd just stand there and clap until my hands went numb. But nothing in all those daydreams prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. The ceremony was being held in a grand hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of place where the chandeliers sparkled like stars and the marble floors looked like they cost more than my old truck. I wasn't used to fancy places like that, but I wore my best black suit, the same one I had worn when Mason graduated college. I even got my boots polished, the scuff marks hidden so no one could say I hadn't tried. I stood there for a moment, breathing deep, telling myself I belonged here because I was Mason's father and that meant something. They led me to my seat at the front row, right where family was supposed to sit. There was a little folded card on the chair, just like all the others. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. I was too busy trying not to trip over the expensive carpet. But when I finally bent down to look, my heart stopped. The nameplate on my chair didn't say Mr. Daniel Cooper, like it should have. It didn't even say father of the groom. No, it said something else. Something that burned itself into my chest so hard I felt like I couldn't breathe. Low-educated fake dad. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A sick joke maybe. I glanced around, thinking someone would rush over, apologizing, swapping it out for the right card. But no one came. And then I heard it, the laughter. Quiet at first, like someone trying to hide it behind their hand, but it grew louder, crueler. When I lifted my eyes, I saw them, Claire's family. The Whitmores. Her mother, Judith, trying to cover her mouth as she laughed. Her father, Dr. Richard Whitmore, smirking like he had just seen a dog wearing a tuxedo. My ears burned. My palms started to sweat. I looked over at Mason, standing near the altar, straightening his cuffs. He hadn't seen it yet. Thank God he hadn't seen it yet. I stood up slowly. My first instinct was to leave. Get out of there before Mason noticed, before anyone else had a chance to point and laugh. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, but I forced them to step away from that awful little card. I made it halfway to the side door when I heard a voice, sharp and clear above the noise. Dad, wait. I stopped. I turned around, and there he was, Mason, jogging down the aisle toward me, the jacket of his navy blue suit flapping behind him. His face was red, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Real anger, the kind I hadn't seen on him since he was a teenager and someone tried to steal his bike. He reached me and grabbed my arm, squeezing tight. His voice shook a little when he said, Dad, let's go home. For a second, I just stared at him, too stunned to speak. I could feel every eye in the room on us, waiting to see what would happen next. But when I looked into Mason's face, into those familiar brown eyes that had once looked up at me from a crib, I knew what I had to do. I nodded. Together, we turned our backs on the ceremony, on the polished floors, the glittering chandeliers, the people who thought they were better than us. I could hear whispers and gasps behind us, but I didn't care. Mason didn't care either. His hand stayed firm on my shoulder, like he was shielding me from every daggered stare in the room. As we pushed through the heavy double doors, I caught a glimpse of Claire standing frozen at the altar, her white dress gleaming under the lights. Her mouth was open in shock, Judith's face was twisted into something ugly, and Dr. Whitmore looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Good. Let them see what it felt like to lose something precious. Outside, the sun was blinding. I blinked hard, trying to adjust. Mason walked a few steps ahead, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. We didn't say a word until we reached the parking lot. I fumbled with my keys for a second, hands still shaking, but Mason took them gently from me. "I'll drive, Dad," he said. I got into the passenger seat like I was moving through water, heavy and slow. As Mason pulled out of the lot, I stared out the window, trying to gather my thoughts. I should have felt humiliated. I should have felt crushed. And part of me did. But there was another part, bigger and stronger, that felt something else entirely: pride. Mason could have ignored it. He could have let them laugh and carried on with his perfect little wedding. But he didn't. He chose me. He chose respect over appearances, loyalty over show. He chose love. We drove in silence for a long time, the city flashing by in blurs of glass and metal. My mind kept going back to that nameplate, the ugly black letters printed so neat and bold. Low-educated fake dad. That's how they saw me. Not as a man who had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Not as a father who had learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers when Mason wanted to dress up as a superhero with a cape. Not as the man who had sat up all night when Mason had pneumonia, praying to a god he wasn't even sure he believed in. No, just some fool they could laugh at. Mason tapped the steering wheel lightly with his fingers. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally, voice low. "I should have seen it coming. I should have known." "You couldn't have known," I said. My throat was thick, but I forced the words out. "And you stood by me. That's all that matters." He glanced over, and for the first time all day, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. And it reminded me of all the other smiles over the years, the missing teeth grins, the sheepish teenage smirks, the proud graduation day beam. Smiles that belonged to the boy I had raised. We didn't go home right away. Instead, Mason pulled into the old diner on 4th Street, the one we used to go to after Little League games. It was nearly empty, just a few tired truckers and a waitress wiping down counters. We sat in a booth by the window. Mason ordered coffee. I ordered pie. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The world outside kept spinning. The Whitmores were probably scrambling to explain why the groom had abandoned the wedding. Maybe they were still laughing at me. Maybe they were cursing me. I didn't care. I had my son. I had the kind of love no degree could buy and no cruel words could tear down. For the first time that day, sitting in that old vinyl booth, I felt at peace. They could call me whatever they wanted. I knew who I was. I was his father. And that was enough. The drive home from the diner was quiet, but not heavy. There was a peace between us, the kind that only comes after the worst has happened and you realize you're still standing. As we pulled into the driveway of our little house on Maple Lane, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. The porch light flickered as it always did. The paint on the fence was chipped, and the lawn could have used a trim. But to me, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. Mason got out first, unlocking the door like he had done 1,000 times growing up. I followed slowly, my legs stiff from sitting too long. Inside, the house smelled like old leather and coffee, comfort smells, familiar smells. Mason dropped the keys on the hallway table, shrugged off his jacket, and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was sadness, raw and deep. "I didn't mean for today to turn out like this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He sat down heavily on the old couch, the one we had patched together more times than I could count. I sat across from him in the recliner that had been my throne for nearly 2 decades. The same chair where I read Mason bedtime stories when he was little. The same chair where I waited up for him when he was 15 and stayed out past curfew. Memories flooded in, uninvited but welcome. I remembered the nights we spent on that couch when the power got cut off, wrapped in blankets, eating cold beans from a can and laughing like it was an adventure. I remembered how, when Mason was about 8, he'd swear he would grow up rich enough to buy me a real leather recliner. One that doesn't squeak when you lean back, he promised. I told him I liked the squeak. It reminded me the chair was alive, just like our home. I smiled at the memory, and for the first time that evening, I felt the weight on my chest lighten a little. Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think, maybe I should have just married someone simpler? Someone who didn't come with a family like that?" I let the question hang in the air. It wasn't my place to tell him who to love. Love wasn't about logic. It wasn't a checklist you could cross off neatly. It was messy, confusing, stubborn. I knew that better than most. Instead of answering right away, I stood up and wandered into the kitchen. I pulled 2 beers from the fridge, cheap ones, the kind we used to split on Saturday nights after working on the truck, and handed one to Mason. He accepted it with a small smile. "You loved her," I said finally, sinking back into my chair. "You don't get to choose where your heart goes. You just hope it's going somewhere good." Mason nodded slowly, staring at the floor. I thought Claire was different. I thought she loved me for who I was, not for how much I could impress her family. I took a sip of my beer. It was bitter, sharp, familiar. Maybe she did. But love isn't just words, son. It's actions. It's who stands beside you when everything falls apart. He looked up at me then, his eyes a little shinier than before. "You always stood by me. Always will." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, and a car rumbled down the street. Life kept moving, even when your heart felt frozen in place. I thought back to the years that had led us here. All the moments that built the bond between us. Scraped knees and broken toys. Parent-teacher conferences where the teachers looked at me like I was a sideshow because I didn't use fancy words or wear pressed suits. Nights when Mason had the flu, and I slept on the floor beside his bed, just to be close if he needed me. Days when I barely had 2 nickels to rub together, but Mason still had lunch money in his pocket. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. Lost my temper sometimes. Missed a few school plays when I couldn't get off my shift. But I never missed the big things. Birthdays. Graduations. Every moment that mattered. And no matter what anyone said about my education or my bank account, no one could ever take that away from me. "You remember," I said, leaning back with a creak, "the time you broke your arm playing backyard football?" Mason chuckled. "Yeah, I thought you were going to kill me." "I thought you were going to kill me," I said, laughing. "You screamed so loud the neighbor came running with a baseball bat, thinking we were getting robbed." Mason laughed harder, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You carried me 2 blocks to the truck. I was heavy back then. You were heavier because you wouldn't stop crying." We both laughed, the sound filling the small room like sunlight breaking through a storm. For a little while, we weren't the father and son who had just walked out of a ruined wedding. We were just 2 stubborn souls, bruised but unbroken, clinging to the one thing that had never let us down, each other. Later that night, after Mason went to bed in his old room, I sat out on the porch with another beer, watching the stars blink overhead. The air was cool, the kind that hinted at fall just around the corner. I rocked slowly in the porch chair, listening to the night sounds, crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of the old wood beneath me. I thought about Claire's parents, about all their money, their degrees, their polished words. None of it had taught them kindness. None of it had taught them respect. They had everything a man could want, except the one thing that mattered most: heart. And maybe, just maybe, the world had a funny way of balancing things out. I didn't know then what would happen next. I didn't know about the news that would break the following morning, or how the very people who had laughed at me would find themselves the laughingstock of the town. But in that moment, sitting on my porch with the night wrapped around me like an old blanket, I knew one thing for certain. I had already won. I had raised a good man. And no insult, no nameplate, no cruel laughter could ever take that victory away. I took a long sip from the bottle and tipped my head back, smiling up at the stars. Let the world think what it wanted. I knew the truth. And so did my son. There's a certain kind of fight that lives deep inside you when you're a man who's had to claw his way through life with nothing but bare hands and stubbornness. I never planned on being a single father. Nobody plans for something like that. Laura and I thought we had forever. She was the smart one between us, the one with dreams bigger than our little town could hold. When she got sick, it felt like the world tilted sideways, and no matter how hard I tried to straighten it, it never really went back. After she passed, it was just me and Mason. I was 24 years old with a mortgage I couldn't afford, a toddler who cried for his mother every night, and a hole in my chest so wide I didn't think anything would ever fill it. People whispered about me back then. I could hear them in the grocery store when they thought I wasn't listening. "Poor kid, he doesn't have a chance. Daniel Cooper's gonna mess that boy up. He should just give the kid to Laura's parents. They've got money, education, a proper home." Laura's parents, the Holloways, didn't waste any time. 2 weeks after the funeral, they showed up on my doorstep with a lawyer and a custody petition. I still remember standing on that porch, Mason clinging to my jeans, staring down at Laura's mother with her perfect hair and her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at me like I was something she found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Be reasonable, Daniel," she said, like she was offering me a deal and not trying to steal my whole world away. "You can't possibly raise him alone. He needs better." I didn't say much. Never been the type for fancy speeches. I just told them no. Simple as that. They didn't listen. Took me to court 3 times. Tried to paint me as unfit because I never finished high school, because I worked with my hands, because my house was small and my wallet was even smaller. I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in that courtroom, wearing the only tie I owned, listening to their lawyer talk about me like I wasn't even human, like I was just some obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. They had charts and expert witnesses and photographs. I had calloused hands, bloodshot eyes, and the desperate love of a man who had lost everything except his boy. It should have been a slaughter. On paper, I didn't stand a chance. But sometimes, God sends you an angel in the ugliest battles. Her name was Julianne Price, court-appointed attorney, barely out of law school. She looked like she should still be taking exams, not fighting battles in front of a judge. But she fought for me like I was her own blood. She dragged every dirty trick the Holloways tried into the light. She showed the court what they really cared about: control, not love. The day the judge ruled in my favor, Mason was curled up on my lap, playing with my work boots. I didn't even hear the first part of the decision. All I heard was the part that mattered. Full custody granted to Mr. Daniel Cooper. I broke down right there in the courtroom. Couldn't help it. Ugly, choking sobs that I tried to swallow but couldn't. Julianne just patted my back awkwardly and said, "You earned this. Don't let anyone tell you different." I didn't. From that day forward, Mason was mine to raise, mine to protect. Every scraped knee, every spelling test, every Christmas morning when there was barely enough under the tree, but somehow it was still magical, I gave it to him with everything I had. Sometimes, late at night when he was little, I'd sit by his bed and just watch him breathe. I was so scared I would screw it all up. That somehow love wouldn't be enough. That maybe the Holloways were right and I wasn't good enough. But every morning when Mason woke up and grinned at me with that gap-toothed smile, I told myself I could figure it out. And I did. Not perfectly. Not by any parenting book standards. But by the only one that mattered: showing up, staying, loving without limits. As he got older, the world didn't get any kinder. Teachers who looked down their noses when I showed up to conferences in my oil-stained boots. Other parents who invited Mason to birthday parties but not me to barbecues. It hurt sometimes, more than I wanted to admit. But Mason never cared. He'd come home from school talking about the kids whose parents had PhDs or corner offices, and I'd brace myself for the day he'd start to wish he had someone better for a father. But it never came. Instead, he'd say things like, "Dad, you're the smartest guy I know. You can fix anything." And he meant it. Not because I could solve algebra problems or negotiate business deals, but because he trusted that when he needed me, I'd always be there. When Mason turned 15, I sat him down and told him about the court battle. Told him how close I came to losing him. I thought he deserved to know. I expected anger maybe, or sadness. But he just sat there quietly, then hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "You didn't lose me, Dad," he said. "You never will." Now, sitting on the porch all these years later, those words came back to me clear as a bell. After everything, the nameplate, the laughter, the humiliation, none of it could touch that bond. They didn't know the battles we had fought together. They didn't know the nights spent wrapped up in each other's stubborn love. They saw a low-educated mechanic. They didn't see the man who had rebuilt a whole world with 2 battered hands and a heart that refused to quit. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me. Mason was asleep inside, safe under the same roof that had sheltered him through scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage rebellions. My boy. My pride. My proof that love didn't need a degree or a pedigree to be real. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. Maybe it would bring more trouble. Maybe it would bring surprises. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of our little corner of the world, I knew this much. I had chosen to fight for Mason when it mattered most. And I would choose it again, 1,000 times over. Because at the end of it all, love wasn't measured in letters after your name. It was measured in the hands that picked you up when you fell. The arms that carried you home when you couldn't walk. The heart that never, not for a single moment, stopped believing you were worth it. And by that measure, I was the richest man alive. There's a certain pride that comes from building something with your own 2 hands, even when no one else sees it. Our life wasn't made of fine things, but it was real. Every crack in the wall, every squeaky step on the stairs, every mismatched plate in the kitchen cabinets, it all told a story. A story of surviving, of laughing when there wasn't much to laugh about, of building a life that was ours. After the custody battle, I was working 2 jobs, days at the factory, nights fixing trucks in the neighbor's garage. Sometimes I'd crawl into bed at 2 in the morning, too tired to even take my boots off. But when Mason would wander into my room in his footy pajamas and climb onto the bed, curling up against me with a sleepy, "Love you, Dad," it made every aching muscle worth it. I didn't know much about raising a kid the right way. Never had a manual. Never had anyone showing me how to do it. My own father had been long gone before I even hit my teens. It was just me, guessing half the time, learning as I went. When Mason had colic and screamed for hours, I paced the floors of our little living room, singing off-key lullabies until he finally slept. When he got older and asked why his mom wasn't here like other kids' moms, I sat him down and told him the truth the only way I knew how, gentle and simple. "She loved you more than anything," I said once, rubbing his back as he blinked up at me with tearful eyes. "And she's watching you every day. You're her best thing." He believed me. And maybe, in some ways, that belief kept both of us going. Money was tight in those years. Real tight. There were days when I skipped dinner just to make sure Mason had enough on his plate. Nights when the electricity company threatened to shut us off. I learned how to stretch $1 so far it could snap. Hand-me-down clothes, used toys from the thrift store, school supplies bought late when they were on clearance. But you know something funny? Mason never once complained. Not when he had to wear sneakers with duct tape on the toes. Not when Christmas meant just one present under the tree. Not when his friends had video games and new bikes and he made do with a football we patched up with shoe glue. Instead, he made me proud in ways I can't even explain. He worked hard at school. He was kind. He helped neighbors rake leaves and shovel snow without being asked. And every time he ran home, sweaty and muddy from playing outside, shouting "Dad," guess what? Like I was the only person in the world he wanted to tell, I knew we were doing just fine. We didn't have a big backyard, but we had enough space for a beat-up old grill and 2 lawn chairs. Every summer, I'd save up for a small camping trip, just me and Mason in a tent that leaked when it rained. We'd fish in muddy rivers, roast marshmallows until they caught fire, and tell ghost stories that made us both laugh too hard to be scared. Those weekends were messy, cheap, and perfect. One night, Mason must have been about 10, we lay under the stars, staring up at the sky. He rolled onto his side and looked at me with a seriousness that didn't match his missing front teeth. "Are we poor, Dad?" he asked. The question hit harder than any punch. I wanted to lie, wanted to tell him we were just like everyone else. But I didn't want to build our life on lies. I thought about it for a second, then said, "We don't have a lot of money, but we're rich in the stuff that matters." He frowned, confused. "Like what?" "Like love. Like laughs. Like always having someone who's got your back." He nodded thoughtfully, like he was storing that answer away somewhere deep inside him. Then he grinned, crooked and full of life. "Then we're the richest people ever." I laughed so hard that night I scared off half the wildlife in the woods. Time kept moving forward, faster than I liked. Mason grew taller, sharper, smarter. He never made me feel small for not knowing the things he was learning in school. Instead, he came home and patiently taught me about algebra, history, and science experiments that half the time ended with the kitchen smelling like burnt sugar. When he made it into college, full scholarship, no less. I stood in the driveway the day he left, pretending I wasn't wiping my eyes on my sleeve. He hugged me so tight my ribs ached. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. "You already have," I choked out. The house felt empty without him, but I kept busy. Fixed up an old motorcycle I'd been meaning to get running for years. Started volunteering at the local youth center, teaching kids how to work on engines. It felt good to give back a little, to pass on what I knew. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Mason would call. Sometimes from his dorm room, sometimes from the library, once from a rainy street corner because his umbrella broke and he wanted to tell me he aced his chemistry exam. No matter how busy he got, he never forgot where he came from. And then, years later, came the day he called me with shaking excitement in his voice. "Dad," he said, breathless, "I met someone. Claire." At first, I was just happy he was happy. She sounded nice, polite, sweet. Maybe a little polished around the edges, but love smooths out the rough spots, right? I didn't think much of it when Mason said her parents were a little formal. Thought maybe they'd warm up once they got to know us. I didn't realize then how much they saw people like me as invisible, as less than, as something to be tolerated at best and humiliated at worst. Maybe I should have seen it coming. But love has a way of making you believe in the best, even when the warning signs are flashing. Still, no matter what happened at that fancy wedding, no matter what bitter laughter tried to rewrite our story, it couldn't erase the life we built together. A life made of hard work and harder love. A life built with calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and the kind of bond that mockery couldn't even scratch. I sat back in my chair that night, listening to Mason's soft breathing through the thin walls of the house, and smiled. They thought they could measure a man by the clothes he wore or the school he graduated from. They had no idea how rich we really were. Growing up, Mason never made me feel like he was embarrassed of me. Not once. Even when the other kids bragged about what their parents did, lawyers, doctors, business owners, Mason would puff out his chest and tell anyone who listened, "My dad can fix anything." He said it like it was the most important job in the world. And to him, maybe it was. When he got older, I worried it would change. That teenage years and peer pressure would make him see the dirt under my nails or the grease stains on my jeans as something shameful. I braced myself for it, honestly, waiting for the day he'd stop inviting me to career days or start hesitating when people asked what his dad did for a living. But that day never came. Instead, I remember the time his high school held a career fair. Kids brought in their parents to talk about what they did. There were engineers and architects and professors with big titles and fancier words than I could follow. I almost told Mason he should pick someone else to stand beside him that day. I didn't want to embarrass him, but he wouldn't hear it. "You're coming, Dad," he said firmly. "You're the smartest man I know." So I went. Wore my best pair of jeans, a clean work shirt, even combed my hair back like Mason used to when he played dress-up as a kid. I stood next to him while he introduced me to his classmates and teachers. "This is my dad," he said, proud as anything. "He's a mechanic. He can fix cars, trucks, lawnmowers, anything with an engine. He even built a go-kart for me from scratch when I was 10. The kids' faces lit up. Some teachers smiled politely, but a few genuinely looked impressed when Mason told them about how we used scrap parts and still made that little go-kart run like a dream. Driving home that night, Mason leaned over and said, "Some dads wear suits, but mine can build things with his hands. That's way cooler." I don't think he realized what that meant to me. Maybe he never will. Even when he left for college, surrounded by kids from rich families with polished backgrounds, he never stopped being proud of where he came from. He'd send pictures of him in his dorm room, grinning like a fool, a poster of a classic Mustang behind him, a car we had rebuilt together one long, greasy summer. Once, during his second year, he brought a few friends home over break. I worried what they'd think of our small house, the cracked driveway, the second-hand furniture. But Mason acted like it was a palace. He showed them the workshop out back where we had spent countless weekends. Told them stories about learning to change oil before he learned to drive. He even pointed proudly at my old recliner in the living room and said, "Best chair in the world." Sat there every night listening to my dad's crazy stories. And when one of his friends joked about the tiny kitchen, Mason just laughed and said, "Yeah, but you've never had burgers better than my dad's." He made me feel like I was 10 feet tall. That's what love does. It doesn't hide you in the shadows. It shines a light on you, even when the rest of the world looks away. Claire entered his life not long after that. I could tell he was head over heels from the start. He talked about her like she was made of sunlight. She was smart, top of her class, working toward a career in international law. Mason couldn't stop grinning whenever he mentioned her. The first time we met, she was polite, a little stiff maybe, but kind enough. I chalked it up to nerves. Not everyone knows what to say to a man who makes his living elbow deep in engines. Her smile was tight, her words careful, like she was afraid to step in oil just by standing next to me. But Mason looked at her like she hung the moon, and that was enough for me. It wasn't until later, at family gatherings and dinners, that I noticed the small cracks. The way her parents would talk over me at the table, using words meant to confuse or belittle. The way Claire would sometimes wince when I mentioned work, like I had said something uncivilized. The way she introduced me to her friends once, not as Mason's dad, but as the man who fixed our car. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe I wasn't their kind of people. Maybe they just needed time. Maybe love could smooth it over the way it always had before. But now, looking back after what happened at the wedding, I realize love alone isn't always enough to bridge certain gaps, especially the kind built from pride and prejudice. I remember one particular conversation with Mason about 6 months before the wedding. We were fixing up the porch swing, replacing a few rotten boards. He was hammering away while I held the new slat steady. "You think Claire's parents like me?" he asked, out of nowhere. I shrugged, careful with my words. "They don't know you like I do. Give it time." He nodded, but the furrow between his eyebrows stayed. "Sometimes I think they see me as." "I don't know. Not good enough," he muttered. "More to the nails than to me." I set down the slat and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Listen, son," I said carefully. "Some people are born thinking they're better than others because of where they went to school or how many zeros are on their paycheck. That's their problem, not yours. You measure a man by how he treats the people who can't do anything for him. By his heart, not his wallet." Mason didn't say anything for a long moment, just kept hammering. But his jaw was set, and I could tell he was storing those words away the same way he always did when something mattered. Maybe that's why, on the day of the wedding, when he saw that awful nameplate and heard the laughter, he didn't hesitate. He remembered what mattered. He chose love over appearances. He chose respect over status. He chose me, not because I was the perfect father, not because I had wealth or titles to offer, but because, when everything else was stripped away, money, education, fancy suits, and big houses, what was left was a bond built from years of late nights, early mornings, scraped knees, burned dinners, repaired engines, bedtime stories, and 1,000 little moments of showing up. And sometimes, that's more than enough. Sometimes, it's everything. The Whitmores were the kind of family that wore their pride like armor. Everything about them was polished, rehearsed, and just a little too perfect. From the first time I met them at a dinner party Claire's parents threw, I could feel the difference. They spoke in clipped, proper tones, like every word was a carefully measured performance. They shook hands too firmly, smiled too tightly, and when they talked about their achievements, degrees, investments, business ventures, it wasn't conversation. It was competition. I tried to fit in. God knows, I tried. I showed up in the best clothes I could afford, kept my elbows off the table, minded my manners the way Laura had once taught me. I smiled when they dropped fancy terms about stocks and private equity. I nodded politely when Dr. Whitmore bragged about the prestigious universities in their family line like it was a crown he wore. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They didn't see me as a man who had raised a son through blood, sweat, and broken dreams. They didn't see the father who had stayed up for days to nurse a sick boy back to health, who had learned how to braid hair for school plays, who had taught a child how to ride a bike by running behind him for hours even though his legs screamed with pain. They didn't see love. They saw dirt under my nails and a high school dropout. They saw someone they couldn't parade in their cocktail parties or drop into conversations with their ivory tower friends. Still, I held my tongue. For Mason's sake. I smiled when they talked down to me, laughed when they made jokes that stung, and swallowed my pride like a bitter pill. Because Mason was happy. Because I believed, foolishly maybe, that marriage would build bridges where words had failed. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, there were signs. Small ones. Claire gently suggesting I get a new suit, something more appropriate for the venue. Judith Whitmore offering to arrange a speech coach if I wanted to say a few words at the reception, said with a syrupy sweetness that barely hid the insult. Dr. Whitmore sending me an etiquette book in the mail with a note. A little light reading before the big day. I could have gotten angry. Lord knows, a younger version of me might have thrown those words right back at them. But years of raising Mason had taught me patience. Taught me to pick my battles. I wasn't about to cause a scene and embarrass Mason at his own wedding. So, I tucked my hurt deep inside. I smiled through tight teeth. I told myself that one day, when Mason had a family of his own, when he held his own child in his arms, he'd understand that sometimes love meant swallowing your pride so your kids could have their day. I wore the new suit. Stiff and uncomfortable, it felt like a costume instead of clothing. I practiced my manners. I sat quietly through endless dinners where they discussed vacations I could never afford and schools I could never dream of entering. I endured it all. For Mason. The morning of the wedding, I woke early. Too early. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the sunrise. I thought about Laura, how proud she would have been. I thought about the little boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares and how he was now a grown man about to start his own life. I told myself that today would be about Mason, not about me, not about the Whitmores. I tucked my hands into the pockets of my new suit and whispered to the empty kitchen, "You did good, Laura." We did good. I drove to the venue with my heart in my throat. The ballroom was grander than I had imagined. Glittering chandeliers, gold-trimmed walls, music floating through the air like perfume. Guests in tuxedos and silk dresses floated around like it was some kind of royal ball. I felt like a bull that had wandered into a china shop. Still, I smiled. I shook hands. I let Judith kiss my cheek and pretended not to notice the way she immediately wiped her hand on her dress. I even laughed at Dr. Whitmore's jokes, even though every word dripped with condescension. Then came the moment that shattered it all. I walked to my assigned seat, trying to ignore the sideways glances, the whispers. When I bent down to read the nameplate on my chair, it felt like someone punched the air right out of my chest. Low-educated fake dad. I stared at it, blinking, hoping it would change if I looked long enough. But it didn't. The letters were crisp, deliberate, cruel. The laughter started softly. A titter here, a snicker there. Then it grew. Ugly. Mean. Judith covering her mouth with her hand, but failing to hide the sparkle in her eyes. Dr. Whitmore shaking his head in mock sympathy. I wanted to disappear. Wanted to sink into the marble floor and never be seen again. But before I could move, before the humiliation could finish crushing me, Mason's voice cut through the noise. Dad. I turned. He was standing at the altar, halfway to me, eyes blazing. Let's go home. Without hesitation, he crossed the room, took my arm, and together we walked out. Past the whispers. Past the gasps. Past the perfect people in their perfect clothes with their perfect lives. Claire didn't follow. Judith didn't call out. Dr. Whitmore didn't move. They let us go like we were the ones unworthy. Outside, the sun was blinding. Mason held the car door open for me like he had 100 times before when he was a boy pretending to be a chauffeur. I slid into the passenger seat, my heart too full to speak. He drove in silence for a while, hands tight on the steering wheel. I'm sorry, Dad, he said finally, voice rough. I should have seen it sooner. I shook my head. You saw it when it mattered. At a red light, he turned to me. I don't care about degrees or bank accounts or any of that crap. You're my father. You're my family. Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them away. That day, I realized something important. Family isn't built in ballrooms or sealed with degrees. It's built in the trenches, one scraped knee, one missed meal, one whispered bedtime story at a time. They could keep their chandeliers and champagne. I had something they would never understand. I had my son's loyalty, and nothing in the world could make me richer than that. The morning after Mason's wedding that wasn't. I woke up before the sun. I couldn't sleep, no matter how tired I was. My mind kept replaying everything from the night before. The mocking laughter, that awful nameplate, the heavy silence as we left the ballroom. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold in my hands, staring out into the gray light of dawn. The world was still turning. Birds were singing. Somewhere across town, people were waking up to their ordinary lives. But for me, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was past anger. What I felt now was something deeper, heavier. A sadness for the way people could twist love into something cruel. I wondered what would happen now. Mason hadn't said much after we got home last night. Just sat on the couch for a long time, staring at nothing. He finally fell asleep sitting up, head tilted against the wall like he had when he was a kid riding in the back seat after a long day. I didn't wake him. I just covered him with a blanket and sat nearby, keeping watch like I always had. I was sipping my second cup of coffee when I heard the rumble of an engine pulling up. I squinted down the driveway and saw Mason's old pickup rolling in, a little battered, a little dusty. It was Theo, his best friend since high school. Theo hopped out, still in his mechanic's uniform, and jogged up to the porch. You seen the news? He asked, panting like he had run the whole way. I frowned. News. Theo shoved his phone at me, the screen already lit up with headlines. Whitmo. I stared at it, unblinking. Below the headline was a photo of Claire's father, Dr. Whitmore, looking grim as reporters crowded around him. Another article headline flashed below it. Sources claim family fortune at risk as authorities move in. My first reaction wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was shock. Theo kept talking, excitement tumbling out of him. Someone leaked a bunch of documents last night, emails, bank statements, internal memos. It's everywhere. The SEC's involved. They're saying Whitmore Industries has been cooking their books for years. I set the phone down slowly. My heart was pounding, but my mind felt strangely calm. Was it karma? Was it justice? I didn't know. All I knew was that the very people who had laughed at me, who had called me a fake, who had tried to make me feel small, they were crumbling under the weight of their own lies. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mason standing in the doorway, hair sticking up in all directions, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I exchanged a look with Theo, then handed Mason the phone. He read the headlines, his eyes widening with every word. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the screen like it was written in a language he didn't understand. Then, slowly, he let out a breath and sank down onto the porch steps. I don't even know what to feel," he said finally. I sat down beside him. "You don't have to feel anything right now. Just breathe." Theo clapped him on the shoulder. "Better to find out now than later, man." Mason nodded, still staring off into the distance. "I almost married into that mess." "You didn't," I said quietly. "You saw the truth when it mattered." We sat there in silence, the three of us, while the sun crept higher and the world around us started to buzz with life. I could hear the neighbors' sprinklers kicking on. Someone down the street was mowing their lawn. It was just another Saturday for most people. But for us, it was the first day of a different life. Around noon, Mason's phone started blowing up. Calls, texts, voicemails. Some were from Claire. Some were from her parents. Some were from people who had been at the wedding, desperate to know what we knew, if we had been part of the leak. Mason didn't answer a single one. He just sat there, staring at the phone, shaking his head. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think they ever loved me? Or was it always about appearances?" I hated that question. Hated that he even had to ask it. "I think they love the idea of you," I said carefully. "The image. The connection. But real love? Real love doesn't humiliate. It doesn't mock. It doesn't care about where you came from or what you wear or what you do for a living. It shows up when you fall. It holds on when things get ugly." Mason swallowed hard. "I don't think they ever really saw me. They didn't deserve to," I said simply. In the afternoon, the news got worse for the Whitmores. More documents surfaced. Anonymous sources came forward. Former employees spoke to the press. It was a tidal wave, and no matter how hard they tried to spin it, they were drowning. Theo eventually left to get back to work. Mason and I stayed on the porch, watching it all unfold from a battered old laptop he set up on the table between us. At one point, we saw a live clip of Dr. Whitmore being swarmed by reporters outside his office. His face was pale, drawn, nothing like the smug man who had smirked at me across the ballroom just a day before. Judith was there too, clutching her pearls like they could save her. Claire wasn't visible in the crowd. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe she was just smart enough to stay away. Mason watched for a few minutes, then closed the laptop with a sigh. "I don't want anything from them," he said. "Not their money. Not their apologies. Nothing. You don't need anything from them," I said. "You've got everything you need right here." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw peace in his eyes. Maybe not happiness yet, but peace. That night, we grilled burgers in the backyard. Just the two of us. No fancy dishes. No white tablecloths. Just two plates balanced on our knees, ketchup dripping down our fingers, laughter filling the warm summer air. We didn't talk about the Whitmores. We didn't talk about the wedding. We just talked about life. About dreams. About the future. Mason told me he was thinking about starting his own business. Something simple, something honest. Maybe a garage of his own. Maybe teaching kids how to work on cars, the way I had taught him. I told him I thought that sounded just about perfect. As the stars came out overhead, I realized something important. The storm had passed, and even though the world had tried to tear us down, even though the laughter still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, it didn't matter anymore. We were still standing, still together, still undefeated. The next few days passed like a blur, but underneath it all, something kept pulling at me. A memory. A secret that I had tucked away so tightly even Mason didn't know about it. It started years ago, after Laura passed. Right around the time I won custody of Mason. I didn't have much, an old house, an older truck, a few $1,000s Laura's life insurance had left behind. It wasn't enough to live comfortably. Not by a long shot. But it was something, and I knew I had to make it count. One afternoon, when Mason was still in diapers, I walked into a community center that offered free financial advice for low-income families. I didn't know anything about stocks or investments. I barely understood savings accounts. But I sat through every workshop, read every battered pamphlet they handed me, and asked 1,000 questions. I wanted to be ready for anything life threw at us. It was there I learned about investing small amounts into companies. Not big flashy gambling. Smart, patient investing. Little by little, year after year. And funny enough, one of the companies I had put a small chunk of Laura's insurance money into was Whitmore Industries. Back then, they weren't the giant they became later. Just another mid-sized manufacturing company. Their stock was cheap, their prospects decent. I figured why not? It wasn't a fortune, just a few $100s here and there. Enough that, over the years, as Whitmore Industries grew into a giant, so did my shares. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't seem important. It was just a quiet thing I did in the background, like fixing the leaky faucet or making sure Mason had enough money for school books. By the time Mason went to college, I had accumulated a surprising number of shares, enough to be considered what they called a minor silent investor. Not enough to sit on their board or throw weight around, but enough that when I sold them, someone would notice. I hadn't touched those shares in years. They just sat there, quietly growing, like a tree planted in a forgotten field, until the night of the wedding. When I saw that nameplate, when I heard the laughter, something in me snapped. Not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. The people who sat there, mocking me, thought I was nothing. They didn't know I owned a small part of the empire they bragged about. They didn't know that with one phone call, I could make their comfortable little world tilt sideways. So I did. I waited until Mason and I got home, waited until he had fallen asleep on the couch, blanket pulled up to his chin like he was a boy again. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out the old laptop I barely used anymore, and logged into my investment account. There they were, hundreds of shares. Enough to matter. I didn't hesitate. I clicked sell. I didn't just sell them to the market. I directed them to a competitor I had researched months earlier, a company that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The transfer went through in less than 20 minutes. By morning, it would be done, and I would be free of them. I didn't do it to destroy them. Honestly, that wasn't even my first thought. I did it because I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my silence. Not my respect. Not my investment in their future. They had already decided what I was worth. They forgot to check who was holding part of their house up. The next morning, the fallout began. News outlets sniffed out the sale quickly. Speculation ran wild. People panicked. Stocks plummeted. Investigations kicked up dust the Whitmores had spent years trying to sweep under expensive rugs. It was chaos. Beautiful, ugly chaos. And all the while, I said nothing. Mason didn't know. No one did. It was my quiet goodbye to people who never deserved a hello. I watched it all unfold with a strange calm. No gloating. No fist pumping. Just the same steady feeling I had whenever I finished fixing an engine. Satisfaction that the work was done, that the gears had turned the way they were supposed to. One night, a few days after the collapse started, Mason and I sat on the porch again. We hadn't said much about the Whitmores lately. It was like we had both agreed, without speaking, to let the past stay where it was. But that night, Mason turned to me with a frown. "You ever feel bad?" he asked. "That they're losing everything?" I thought about it for a long minute. "No," I said finally. "Because what they built was hollow. It was built on lies. On hurting people smaller than them. It was always going to fall. They just didn't think it would happen so soon." Mason nodded, staring out at the stars. "You think Claire knew?" he asked after a while. I shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't change anything." He sat quietly, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. I reached over and clapped a hand on his back. "You don't owe them anything, Mason," I said. "Not your guilt. Not your regret. Sometimes, when a house catches fire, it's not your job to run back inside." He let out a shaky breath. I wanted it to be real, you know? The love. The family. All of it. "I know, son," I said softly. "And it will be. One day. With someone who doesn't need to measure your worth before they decide to love you." We sat in silence after that. Comfortable. Steady. Like two stones in a river, weathered but unmovable. Inside the house, the old clock ticked on. The world turned. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. A week later, I officially closed my investment account. Sold off the rest of the small pieces I'd gathered over the years. I didn't need them anymore. Didn't need the security blanket. We had something better. We had each other. And we had freedom. Sometimes, it's the unseen hands that shape the world the most. The ones nobody notices. The ones the rich and powerful laugh at, dismiss, or forget, until those hands quietly let go, and everything they thought was unshakable starts to fall. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apology. I didn't even need them to know it was me. The only thing I needed was already sitting beside me on that porch. A son who had chosen me, and a life that no amount of money could ever replace. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. After everything that happened, the wedding disaster, the collapse of Whitmore Industries, the endless stream of news articles painting Claire's family in a new, uglier light, I thought Mason might be broken for a long time. Thought he might wall himself off, become hard and bitter like some men do after betrayal. But that's not the kind of man Mason was raised to be. Slowly, like the first stubborn buds pushing through frozen soil, he started to heal. It began with small things. He got up early again, started fixing things around the house without being asked, changed the oil in the truck, painted the porch railing. Little tasks that might have seemed meaningless to someone else but meant the world to me. They meant he was choosing life over anger, movement over bitterness. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of notebooks and a laptop spread out in front of him. "What's all this?" I asked, pouring myself a coffee. He looked up, his eyes brighter than I'd seen them in weeks. "I'm thinking about starting my own garage, Dad." I blinked. "Your own business?" He nodded. "Not just repairs. Teaching too. Classes for high school kids who want to learn a trade. Apprenticeships. Real work with real skills." Pride surged so fast in my chest it almost knocked me over. "That's a damn good idea, son," I said, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. He grinned back, a little sheepishly. Figured it was about time I started building something real. Something that matters. Over the next few weeks, Mason threw himself into planning. He found an old building on the edge of town, an abandoned mechanic's shop with cracked windows and a roof that needed fixing. It was a mess, but it had good bones, just like Mason. Strong, steady, built to last. I helped him every step of the way. We patched drywall, replaced broken tiles, cleaned out years of dust and grime. Some nights we worked until midnight, covered in paint and sweat, laughing about how sore we'd be in the morning. But there was joy in the work, a kind of sacred satisfaction that money couldn't buy. And somewhere along the way, something even better happened. Mason met Leah. It wasn't some grand movie moment with fireworks and slow motion running across a field. It was simpler than that. Realer. She worked at the hardware store where Mason and I made what felt like 100 trips every week. Short woman, big brown eyes, calluses on her hands from working the floor. No makeup, no airs. Just a bright laugh and a way of talking that made you feel like you mattered. I saw it happen almost in slow motion. One afternoon, Mason was arguing with the clerk about the difference between two brands of sealant when Leah stepped in, patiently explained the difference, and gave Mason a smile that turned him into a stammering fool. That night, he couldn't stop talking about her. "She's smart, Dad," he said, practically glowing. "She knows more about tools than I do." I just smiled and said, "Sounds like you finally met your match." It didn't take long. A few coffee dates turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long walks through the park. Long walks turned into nights when Mason came home humming under his breath like a man with a brand new song in his heart. He brought her over to dinner a month later. I made my famous burgers on the grill, and we ate out back under the stars. Leah fit right in, laughing at our terrible jokes, teasing Mason about how he still couldn't remember the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. But what struck me most was how she looked at him. Not like he was surprised to be one. Not like he was a stepping stone to a better life. She looked at him like he was already enough. And for a man who had spent too many months questioning his worth, that look was everything. Later that night, after Leah had gone home and Mason and I were cleaning up, he turned to me, shy and serious. "I think she's the one, Dad." I clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You'll know. When the time's right, you'll know." And he did. 3 months later, Mason proposed. Nothing fancy. No flash mobs or choreographed dances. Just a quiet evening in the little shop he was still fixing up, kneeling on one dusty knee with a simple ring and a heart full of hope. Leah said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was a small affair. Backyard, under the old oak tree that Mason used to climb as a boy. Close friends, a few neighbors, Theo as the best man. No fancy nameplates. No marble halls. No one cared about degrees or income brackets. All that mattered was the laughter that filled the air and the tears that filled my eyes as I watched my son marry a woman who saw him for everything he was and nothing he wasn't. When they exchanged vows, Mason didn't talk about wealth or appearances. He talked about loyalty, about late nights fixing broken things together, about love built through work and patience and stubborn hope. When it was over and Mason and Leah danced barefoot in the grass, I sat back in a lawn chair, a cold beer in my hand, and felt a peace deeper than any I'd ever known. We had come full circle, from a courtroom where I fought to keep my son, to a ballroom where they tried to laugh me away, to a backyard where real love finally stood tall and proud. Later that night, Mason found me sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars. He dropped down beside me, still in his wedding clothes, tie loose, hair a mess from all the dancing. "Thanks for everything, Dad," he said quietly. "You did this yourself, son?" I replied. "You built this life. You chose it." He shook his head. "I wouldn't have known how to choose it if you hadn't shown me first." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. And I realized something. The battles I had fought, the humiliation, the sacrifices, the loneliness, they had all been worth it. Every scraped knuckle, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer when I didn't know how we were going to make it. Because they led to this. To a son who knew what real love looked like. And a life richer than any fortune could buy. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, a cold drink in my hand, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. I rock slowly in my old chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and I think about the life I built, not with bricks or blueprints, but with hands that stayed steady when the storms came. I watch Mason through the open window, inside the house he helped rebuild with Leah. Their twins, Lily and Jack, tumble across the living room floor, a blur of giggles and tiny socked feet. Leah chases them, laughing breathlessly, while Mason pretends to be a growling bear, crawling after them on all fours. Their home is simple, like mine always was. No grand chandeliers, no marble floors. Just a place built with love, patched with patience, and filled with a laughter so real it hums in your bones. Every so often, Mason glances out the window at me, grins, and waves. I wave back, feeling something settle deep inside me, something stronger than pride, deeper than satisfaction. Peace. Years ago, when Claire's family tried to shame me at that wedding, I thought maybe they had stolen something from me. Maybe they had left a mark that would never heal. But now, looking at the life Mason and Leah have made, I realized the truth. They didn't steal anything. They only revealed what had been strong all along. Family isn't measured by titles, or wealth, or the kind of degrees you hang on the wall. It's measured by who shows up, who stays, who loves you when loving you isn't fashionable. It's measured by scraped knees kissed better, by broken hearts patiently mended, by old trucks kept running longer than they should. It's measured by two tired hands that built a life out of nothing but grit and a whole lot of stubborn hope. I lean back in the chair and close my eyes for a moment, letting the evening breeze brush against my face. I think about Laura, about the promises we made when we were young and reckless and thought we had all the time in the world. I like to believe she's still watching, somewhere beyond the clouds, smiling at the life we carved out of heartbreak and hard days. I imagine her sitting beside me now, laughing that soft laugh she always had, reaching over to squeeze my. You both did good. Sometimes Mason comes out after the kids are in bed, carrying 2 beers. He'll sit beside me, stretching his long legs out in front of him, and we'll talk about nothing and everything. About how Jack thinks he's a dinosaur, about how Lily refuses to go to sleep unless she hears 3 bedtime stories in a row, about how scary it is to raise kids, to wonder if you're doing it right, to worry you're making mistakes you can't see yet. I get scared sometimes, Dad, he admitted once, staring up at the stars. Scared I'll mess it all up. I chuckled low in my throat, took a slow sip of my drink, and said, "Welcome to being a parent." He laughed, shaking his head. "But you made it look easy." I turned to look at him then, at the strong, kind man he had become. "It wasn't easy," I said. "Not for a single minute. I just loved you enough to make it through." That's the secret no one tells you about family, about life. It's not about getting everything right. It's not about never falling down. It's about getting back up. Every single time. About showing up even when you're tired, even when you're scared, even when you don't have a clue what you're doing. It's about loving so hard that all the broken pieces start to fit together in new ways. And sitting there beside my son, under a sky full of stars, I realized something else. The Whitmores had laughed at me once, called me a low-educated fake dad, tried to paint me as less than. But none of that mattered anymore. Because while their empire crumbled, While their carefully constructed lives unraveled in headlines and courtrooms, my life was here, alive, breathing, growing stronger every day. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Mason built his garage up from the ground. It's a small place with grease-stained floors and a giant hand-painted sign that reads, Cooper's Garage. Honest work, honest people. Every day, kids from the high school come by after classes to learn how to fix engines, change oil, patch tires. Mason teaches them with the same patience I once taught him. Leah runs the front office, twins strapped to her hips more often than not, managing invoices and ordering parts with a baby on each arm. Sometimes when I visit, the kids call me Mr. Cooper or Coach and ask me to show them tricks on old carburetors. I teach them everything I know, just like I did with Mason. Watching them grin with grease on their faces, I realized that somehow, without even planning it, we built something bigger than just a life. We built a legacy. A place where kids who felt overlooked could find pride in their hands, in their skills, in the knowledge that they mattered. And Mason, he stands at the heart of it all. Not because of a fancy name. Not because of a silver spoon. Because he knows what real value looks like. Because he was raised on it. One night, after a long day at the shop, Mason found me again on the porch. He sat down beside me without a word, handed me a cold beer, and stared out at the field stretching under the moonlight. After a while, he spoke. Thanks for fighting for me, Dad. For everything. I clinked my bottle against his and said, always. Because that's what real fathers do. They show up. They stay. They love even when it's hard, when it's messy, when the world tells them they're not enough. They prove the world wrong, not with speeches or money or shiny things, but with the simple, stubborn act of being there. And tonight, as I sit here rocking under the wide-open sky, I know that no matter what the world tried to say about me, I was never a fake father. I was never low anything. I was a real man, a real father. And I had built a life that no laughter, no cruelty, no nameplate could ever erase.